Nancy Martin's greatest love is quilting. Nancy lives with her husband Dan in this Cape Cod-style home in Woodinville, Washington, where she enjoys this lovely view from her home studio as she sews. It is here that Nancy designs and machine pieces her quilts, seated amidst her favorite collection, fabric. This is also where she writes her books. A collector of many things, Nancy's home abounds with her quilts and nostalgia. Nancy's teaching tours take her all over the world. Between trips, Nancy spends most of her day working in her home studio, but does spend part of each day at that patchwork place. Nancy and Dan started That Patchwork Place Incorporated in 1976, a company that has published over 50 different quilting books internationally. Books from this company are known for their fine quality photographs and excellent directions. Nancy is president of That Patchwork Place and is responsible for the editorial functions. Besides being a quilter of 14 years, Nancy is a former school teacher, so she brings expertise and experience to writing clear and precise directions.
Quilt making years, but each year I find myself struggling to make time to make all the quilts that I'd really like to make or stitch all the samples that are needed for my classes and books. I knew if I were to continue quilt making that I would need to come up with some techniques that would enable me to quickly piece, but accurately piece these quilts in a shorter amount of time. Well, I had been using the rotary cutter to cut my quilt since about 1982, and I was familiar with True to Use template-free quilt making series of books. This had helped me to define my thinking about rotary cutting. I had also worked with Marcia McCloskey on several projects, and we had written several books together. Marcia had shared with me her technique for bias strip piecing. Simply, she pieced 2 strips of fabric together, placed a template on top, and cut it out with scissors. The resulting shape was this. The technique, but I wasn't a scissors cutter, I was a rotary cutter. So I wanted to adapt the technique to my own quilt making methods. In doing so, I came up with a tool which I use in my quilt making, and that's called the bias square. It's a cutting guide, a 6-inch ruler, so to speak, with measurements along 2 sides and a diagonal line right down the middle that helps you cut quick, accurate pieces. The bias square is the name of the tool, and it's also what I call the technique I devised, because here's what results when you use this tool, and those are bias squares. These are the foundation of all my quilts. Well, when I went to classes and quilt conferences and people saw me using this technique, they encouraged me to share it with others. So Marcia and I got together and we devised a series of quilts that were built on the bias square. We then got the words on paper, and the result was our book, Back to Square One. I'd like to share some of these tips for rotary cut quilts and bias square quilts with you. And the first thing that I want to do is to help you analyze quilts to see if they would be a good candidate for rotary cutting. I have some quilts I'm going to share with you. This first one was designed by Carol Ann Palmer and stitched by myself. It's called Woodland Christmas, and it consists of 2 alternate blocks. We have the tree block and the Puss in the Corner block. Let's look just a minute a little closer at some of these blocks, especially this Puss in the Corner block. What I'm looking for are segments that could be cut from strips rather than to cut individual quilt pieces. Well, when we looked at the Puss in the Corner block, we see that the segment on this side, 2 squares in the corner and a rectangle in the middle, is identical to the segment over here. 2 squares in the corner and a rectangle in the middle. So we could cut strips of fabric and then cut them apart into segments and use them not only in this, on both sides of this Puss in the Corner block, but in the other Puss in the Corner blocks we see throughout the quilt. The same would hold true for the middle section. We have a large square, and then we have a rectangle above and below it. We could strip pieces together, a darker section for the center, lighter sections for the outside, and cut those strips apart, and then use those segments not only in the center here, but here's the identical segment here, and here, and here. So we have a good candidate for a rotary cut quilt. Let's look at another. This is a double 9 patch. And it's called a 9 patch because it has 9 patches or 9 pieces in the block. And this is one typical block, and each block has 5 9 patches in it. Let's look at one of these 9 patches. Well, we're supposed to be looking for identical configurations. We see that on this side of the 9 patch, we have the same colors and exactly the same shape and the same order. We have 2 dark squares on the outside and a light square in the middle, 2 dark squares on the outside and a light square in the middle. So we could cut strips. We could cut 2 dark strips and stitch them to each side of a light strip. We also could use the very same strips in this middle segment. Again, 2 light strips, and we could put it this time with a dark strip in the center and cut it apart into segments to use for the quilt. When we sew these 3 segments together, we get a 9 patch, but we could also use them for various blocks across the top of the quilt. So this is another good candidate for rotary cutting. The other quilt that I want to share with you that would be a wonderful candidate is this Burgoyne Surrounded by Donna Innes. Now, when you first look at a quilt like this, you might be taken with the thought, well, that's much too intricate for me. I could never do a quilt like that. That's not true. What you need to do is to learn to look at a quilt and to analyze it and to break it down into simple elements that you're familiar with. And we can see some right here. We can see the 9 patch that I just pointed out to you earlier. There it is near the 4 corners of the block. We have an identical rectangular segment used on all sides of the block. We have 4 patches in all 4 corners, and we have a 9 patch of sorts in the center. Now I'll call it a 9 patch because it has 9 pieces, but when you look, they're not all the same size. But look at that center segment I'm pointing to. It's identical to this rectangular segment out here. Same color, same size, and even this is the same color configuration, although not the same size as this. So we have a good candidate for rotary cutting. And they pull all these elements together, and they also show Donna's lovely quilting stitches. How do we rotary cut quilts? I'd like to share with you some of the tools we would use for a rotary cut quilt. The first tool that we need for rotary cutting is the rotary cutter itself. It comes in 2 sizes, large and small. I usually use a large cutter. I'm more comfortable with it, and I'm able to cut through more layers of fabric with it. Now, the cutter has a guard on it. It clicks off and on. The guard is used to protect you from cutting yourself when it's not in use. So every time you're not using your rotary cutter, make sure that you click the guard on. It's called a rotary cutter because there is a blade that is shaped like a wheel, and it rolls along. I'm going to show you some basic safety practices in using the cutter just a little later, but I want to show you the other things you need to use with this cutter. You'll need to cut on a surface, and that surface is a mat. I usually use this self-healing mat. Now, to guide your rotary cutter, you'll need a ruler or a cutting guide, and there are many available, and I have many, in fact. I use more than one depending on what I'm cutting and for what purpose. This ruler has a lip along one edge, which enables you to put it on top of your mat, and it snuggles right up to the edge and it aligns it and keeps it from moving around. Other rulers are less wide, and they have special lines or angles on them that you might find helpful in your cutting, such as this 45-degree angle or the 60-degree angle. For shorter cuts, it's nice to use a shorter ruler, so sometimes I will use that. But my very special ruler is the bias square. That's the square I told you about earlier, 6 inches square with a diagonal cutting guide down the middle that will help you cut perfect bias squares. Well, now that we've seen some of the tools available, let's get fabric and show you how to do some rotary cutting. The first thing we need to do is to prepare our fabric for rotary cutting, and you want to make sure that you are working with pre-washed fabric. Many people like to work on fresh fabric, but you're inviting tragedy for your quilt later on. Not only from the point of pre-shrinkage, but from the point that fabric dyes are not always stable and color fast these days. So you need to make sure you have washed all your fabric and washed them to the point where the dyes no longer run. Once you have done that, you're ready to start working with your fabric and cutting. I'm going to start by showing you a few simple shapes that we can rotary cut. The first being a square, and I'm going to use the bias square to do that. The first thing I will do is to place my bias square on top of the fabric, and I am cutting 2 layers of fabric here. And I'm going to cut a 3-inch square. Now, I mentioned earlier we have cutting guides or measuring guides along both edges, but I'm not positioning the bias square so that the 3 inches are along the edge, because our first cut is to remove and separate the fabric. So I'm going beyond the 3-inch point, and I'm cutting forward, and I'm cutting across, and there you see I've separated the fabric. Now our second cut is what makes it accurate. So we turn the fabric around, and this time when I put the bias square down, the measurement line for 3 inches is along both sides, and I will cut down, and I will cut across, and there I have a perfect 3-inch square. How about a rectangle? How hard would that be to do? Let's take our bias square and try and cut a piece, let's say 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Now remember, that first cut just removes it from the fabric. So I'm beyond the 2.5-inch mark and beyond the 4.5-inch mark as I cut down and across. We're going to turn that around now that I've separated the fabric. And I'll line up my bias square so that the 2.5-inch mark and the 4.5-inch mark is right there. And we will make the final 2 cuts, the cuts that make it accurate, as we go down and across. And there I've cut a perfect rectangle. Now these rotary cutting directions are geared for a right-handed person. So remember, when you use them, your rotary cutter will always be in your right hand, your ruler will be held with your left hand, and your fabric will always be coming from the right. If you're a left-handed person, you're going to need to reverse these directions. Let's graduate on to strips now. The first thing you will need to do when you're cutting strips is to make sure that we have a long, straight edge to cut along. So here you see usually what it looks like when your fabric comes from the store or off the bolt. Your cut is not always straight. So you need to take your rulers and to square up the edge of the fabric. So what I want to do is to take my bias square and put it down here along the fold and align the ruler beside of it. Now this will be the longest cut you'll ever have to make. I'm going to show you something that'll let you make shortcuts for the rest of your cutting of these strips. So we place the ruler next to the bias square, and we're going to need to roll our cutter along the length of the ruler from one end to the other. Now here are some basic rotary cutting tips when you're cutting with a long ruler. One is that this ruler, because it does not have a lip on it, may tend to slide from side to side if I hold it down here. It may pivot a bit. So as you cut, you're going to need to move your hand down the length of the ruler as you move the cutter so that it's always perfectly supported. Secondly, it sometimes helps if you keep these 3 fingers and your thumb on the ruler and take this little finger and position it off to the side. That gives you a bit of stability as you roll along here. Other thing is that you want to have your rotary cutter rolling before you come up to the fabric. Start rolling beyond the ruler and come up through and make one long continuous movement. So let's do our first strip. I'm going to use the bias square to make sure that we're aligned. I have my ruler in position. I remove the bias square, click off the guard, start rolling, and go down the continuous length of the strip. And there I've cut my first straight cut, and we're ready to go on and cut a strip. We're going to make 1-inch 9 patches. They finish to 1-inch square. So working with our standard 1/4-inch seam allowance, we're going to have to cut 1 1/2 inch wide strips. Now your ruler will have measurements on it, and we place the ruler this time over top the fabric, and I align it so that it reads 1 1/2 inches all the way along. But I told you we were only going to have to cut 1 long strip. Here's your shortcut for doing shorter cuts. We're going to fold the fabric in half, and that way we'll cut through 4 thicknesses and we'll be able to do shorter cuts. Let's put the ruler on at 1 1/2 inches, and remember, I'll support it with at least 1 finger off the ruler, and we're going to roll along, start rolling before we come to the ruler, and make our 1 1/2 inch strip. There you are. I need another one of those for my 9 patch, so I'll cut another one. So we've got 2 light ones, and I need one of a dark color. So let's take our dark color fabric, and here you can see I've made my straight cut, and I folded it so I'm cutting through 4 thicknesses, and I need to cut my 1 1/2 inch strip. Now I've got the 3 necessary strips ready for my 9 patch. What I need to do now is to go to my sewing machine and seam those together. But before I do that, I'd like you to practice some of your rotary cutting. I'd like you to practice rotary cutting squares. I'd like you to practice rotary cutting rectangles and doing strips. When you're ready to sew your strips together, there are a few tips that I can give you to help you sew accurate 1/4-inch seams. One of the first things you need to know is where 1/4 inch will fall on your sewing machine. Oftentimes it's not marked on the throat plate of many machines, nor are standard presser foots built with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you'll need to know where to place your fabric in relationship to the presser foot. When I have my strips ready to sew, I don't pin them, but I align them right side to right side, and I'm going to put them under the presser foot, lower the presser foot, and in the case of my machine, I have the edge of the fabric just inside the edge of the presser foot. Now, I don't pin my fabrics, but I evenly feed them through the machine, doing my accurate 1/4 inch seam down the length of the fabric. Let's watch while I do that. I have another navy strip that I need to join to the other side of the light strip. And we're going to place those pieces together the same way as we did earlier, right sides together, and I'll get the raw edges even, and I'm going to stitch along with an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. There we are. We have the 2 dark strips stitched to either side of a light strip. Now remember, for the 9 patch, there's a second configuration or pattern of strips that we need to make the 9 patch. This time we'll need to stitch the light strips to the outside of a dark strip. And let's begin by aligning the right sides of the fabric together. And sewing them in an accurate 1/4 inch seam. And now we're ready to add the 3rd strip. We'll align the raw edges. Now we're ready to press. I'd like to share with you some tips on pressing your strips so they will come out neat, square, and accurate. I press my strips from both sides, both the wrong side of the fabric and the right side. And I begin with the wrong side, and I start at one end of the strip, and I pull the strips out to the side, away from the center strip when I begin pressing. And a general rule to remember is always press the seam allowance toward the darker fabric. That way you won't see a shadow coming through the lighter fabric on your quilt. So I'm going to hold those seams out, begin with my iron, and gently press down the length of the strip. Now remember, we're pressing, not ironing, and there is a difference. Fabric has tension, it can stretch and distort. Now we need to turn our strip over and press from the opposite side. And what you're looking for when you're pressing from this side is to make sure that there are no tiny little pleats there to distort your accuracy. We want to make sure that these strips are nice and flat, not pleated. These strips are now ready for cutting. Now that we've cut and pressed our strips, let's use the bias square to cut them apart into our segments. We're going to take the bias square and place it on top of one of the strips of fabric. Now, we cut our strips 1.5 inches wide, and our segments for the 9 patch also need to be cut 1.5 inches wide. So, I align it with 1.5 inches and make sure that one of the cross guidelines is on top of your fabric. And we're going to take and cut a 1.5 inch segment, and then another 1.5 inch segment, and then another 1.5 inch segment. Now, I need to do the same thing with my white piece of fabric. So let's cut that into 1.5 inch segments. Now, I need to straighten this up. I can look at the end of that and see that that's not very perfectly aligned. It's not very straight. Cross lines to line up with the fabric. Now I'm ready to make the first 1.5 inch cut, knowing that it'll be nice and square, and another 1.5 inch cut. Now, to save time, some people like to stack these two strips, the light and the dark strips, for their cutting. I'll show you how that would work, but you must make sure that your fabrics are cut and pressed very carefully. And they would put the light on top of the dark, like this. Make that first straight cut that we talked about earlier to square off your fabric and make sure you're in alignment. And then they would measure 1.5 inches down those two segments. What's the advantage of this? Well, when you're ready to sew these pieces together, they're already next to each other, right sides together. And this cuts time for you. Now's a good time for you to stop the video, practice sewing your strips together, and then cutting those strips into segments. You'll find these segments that we just cut are really rather easy to sew together because of our opposing seam allowances. And if you look closely, you'll see that because we always pressed our seam allowance toward the darker fabric, on the top of the strip, the seam allowance is pressed in this direction, and on the bottom it goes in the opposite direction. That's what we mean by opposing seam allowances. On the next seam allowance, we have the same situation. It is pressed toward the darker fabric, so they go in opposite directions on the bottom and the top. Now, before I sew those, what I do is to pin them in place, snuggle those seams right up against each other. You can feel them actually butt into each other. Take a second pin for the other intersection, put that in place, but I'm not going to sew across those pins. I'm going to remove them right before the needle comes to them. Let's look and see how well they match. perfect seam allowances. Remember, this is a 9 patch, so we need to add one more segment on the other side. I'll take it, align them, snuggle those seam allowances up to each other, and pin them in place. Remember, I'm going to remove those pins, not sew over them. And here we have it, a perfect 9 patch. Many of my favorite quilts contain triangles, and it's possible to rotary cut these triangles if you know a little bit about grain lines and a little math. Let's start with the grain lines on fabric. Let's examine this piece of fabric. You all know that we refer to this tightly woven edge as the selvage, and of course the other edge we call the fold. Now, the grain that runs parallel to this selvage is called the lengthwise grain, and it has the least stretch. When I tug on each end, you can see that there's not much give in that fabric. Let's examine the crosswise grain. I'll open out my fabric, and the crosswise grain is the grain that runs from selvage to selvage all the way across this fabric. When I tug on the edge of the fabric along the crosswise grain, you can see there's a little more give to our fabric. But the stretchiest grain of all is our bias grain. Now, to find the bias, fold over a corner of your fabric. When I tug along that edge, look how much stretch and give there is. That is the least stable of grains. That is your bias grain. And you can take advantage of that in your quilt making, but there are times when you want to avoid having pieces cut on the bias grain. Those times are for the outside edges of the block and the outside edges of your quilt. If you were to cut your quilt pieces so that the bias edge were along the outside edge, there'd be a good possibility that your quilt block could stretch and distort, or even your whole quilt top if you had bias edges along the outside edge. But knowing what we do about straight grain edges and bias edges, we can put that to work for us also in cutting our quilt pieces. Let's look at 2 types of triangles that I have here. Now, they are identical in size, but there's something very different about them, and that's the placement of the grain lines. We're going to begin with this half square triangle, and a half square triangle will have the straight grains, which are the lengthwise and the crosswise grain, along the outside edges, along the 2 short edges. And it has the bias grain right here along the long edge. When I tug on that, you can see how unstable that is. Now, when these pieces are put together in a quilt, these are the edges of the triangle that usually fall along the outside edge of your quilt block. Let's see how to cut that half square triangle. Told you it was very easy to rotary cut if we knew a little math. We're going to start by cutting a square 2 inches, because this is going to be the basis of the rest of the triangles that we're going to cut. Now, you know with our 1/4 inch seam allowance that if we wanted to add the seam allowance to a 2 inch finished square, we would put a 1/4 inch on each side. So I would mean a 2 1/2 inch square. And I'm just going to cut that first piece to remove it from the fabric, and then I'll turn my square and I'll align the bias square and cut 2 1/2 inches. All right, how about the triangle to be connected to this square? Well, I can't cut that at 2 1/2 inches and cut it in half. I'm talking about a half square triangle. I need to cut it a little larger. And if we study the graphics of this, we will see that although you add a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this edge and on this edge, it's necessary to add 5/8 inch on either of these points to accommodate the point. So when we add that all up, our basic 2 inches, our 1/4 inch, and our 5/8 inch, it's going to be necessary to cut 2 7/8 inches. And that's exactly what we do. We're going to cut a 2 7/8 inch square, and that's what's nice about the bias square. It has markings at the 1/8 inch mark, and I'm going to make my first cut to remove it from the fabric, and then we'll take our second cut and we'll align the bias square at 2 7/8 inches. And then I said this is a half square triangle. Well, it's called that because it's half of a square. So I'm going to cut my square in half. I'm going to turn my bias square and align it from corner to corner and make a cut. And there I have my perfect half square triangle. Now, when I put it next to the square that I originally cut, you'll see that the point extends a little. You may like to do what I do in my quilt making and to nub these triangles so they align with your other pattern pieces. So I'll put the bias square back on top of the square that I cut, and with the 2.5 inch measurement being along the outside, and nub those extra pieces off. Now let's align it back up. There you can see we have perfect sized triangles that would sew onto the square that we cut earlier. Now let's look at a quarter square triangle. When we examine this triangle, we see that the straight grain is along the longest edge, and that we would put along the outside edge of a quilt block or your quilt. And we see the bias edges are on these two shorter edges. Now, you might guess the quarter square triangle is named that because it's cut completely differently. And I'll tell you the math for the quarter square triangle. We would need to add a 1/4 inch seam allowance here and here, but on these points we need that 5/8 of an inch. So when we add 5/8 of an inch and 5/8 of an inch to that basic 2 inches that we started with earlier, we're going to come up with 3 1/4 inches. So let's take and cut a 3 1/4 inch square. And remember again, the first cut is just to remove it from the fabric. And place the bias square on it, aligning it. Cut up, over. And a quarter square triangle is made by cutting a square in quarters. So we need to cut across this piece diagonally twice. And you don't move the pieces in between. I'm going to cut once in this direction, and without moving the pieces, I'm going to move my bias square and cut once from this direction. And there we have perfect quarter square triangles. Let's match them up against our 2 inch, and you see how they would sew onto there. Now's a good time for you to stop your video and practice cutting half square triangles and quarter square triangles. Practice cutting a size that will align with the 2 inch finished square, and then practice again for a size that will align with the 3 inch finished square. My favorite type of triangle doesn't even have the word triangle in its name. It's the bias square. And if we look closely here at this bias square, we'll see a square that is composed of 2 triangles that have been pieced together. As I said earlier, this is the foundation of most of my quilts. Let's take a look at some of those quilts. First is Lady of the Lake. This is done in a lovely dark blue and light blue color scheme. We have 16 bias squares in each block which surround a center block, and that center block is divided also into light and dark. This quilt pieces up easily and quickly with the bias square. This wedding ring quilt, pieced by Marcia McCloskey, has an Amish coloration to it. And look at all the bias squares in those blocks. Each block combines black fabric with a varying bright color fabric, sometimes pink, sometimes purple, sometimes blue, in the bias squares. Let's look at the smokehouse quilt behind me, and look at all the wonderful bias squares in this quilt. We see each time the green is combined with the light background fabric, and it makes a wonderful overall pattern when we stand back and look at the quilt, sort of like an ocean waves design. Lost Ships is a traditional pattern, again with bias squares. And look at the large-scale paisley in the bottom corner of each block. It's a wonderful way to showcase a large print fabric. And the bias squares are a perfect contrast. They're pieced from muslin and various small prints, some of them even checks and stripes. They look like they could be shirtings. Tree of Life is another Amish interpretation. This one again done by Marcia McCloskey. And again, for the bias squares, we have black fabric, which is alternated with various bright color fabrics. Sailboats, also done by Marcia McCloskey, again uses bias squares, this time in the sails. And if we look at those sails, we see various red and white fabrics pieced together for bias squares. Delectable Mountains is another wonderful quilt made from bias squares, and this time it's made just from two fabrics, muslin and a red print fabric. And these bias squares are used both in the block, we see them in a neat little row along here, and also along the border. Sawtooth Star, done by Marcia McCloskey, also uses bias squares. This is a type of feathered star, and you'll see the bias squares are used on just the inside edges of those triangles to give this a nice touch. And it's real easy to cut small size bias squares using the bias square tool. Ribbon Basket by Mary Hickey is a wonderful quilt composed of bias squares. Would you believe it? Look at the variety in those baskets. Yet the same number of bias squares are cut from each basket. Just 10 bias squares. Sometimes the dark fabric is on the outside of the basket. Sometimes the light fabric is on the outside. And on several baskets, Mary has turned the position of the bias square so it gives a handle a different configuration. Here we have an Ocean Waves top made from bias squares. It's done in a navy and muslin color scheme, just two colors again. And you have to be real careful when you piece a top like this from just two colors because the contrast is so great that all the stitching must be in perfect alignment and match up. But look how accurate we can be by using those bias squares. And of course we have a feathered star quilt, among the favorites of many quilters. Look how tiny the bias squares are along the center of this block. But they're perfectly easy to cut with the bias square, and those very same bias squares are used up here in the pineapple border. Again, bias squares that were cut probably 1.25 inches and finished to 3/4 of an inch, all done accurately. One of my favorite ways to use bias squares are in miniature quilts. And I have a series of miniature quilts here done by Mary Hickey in which she's used bias squares. You know, it's possible to be remarkably accurate in these miniature quilts by using the bias squares. These squares were cut 1 inch and they finished to 1/2 inch. And they're just remarkable in this prairie lily quilt. Let's look at Strawberry Basket. And the bias squares are used for the handle. And we have bias squares used in monkey wrench at each corner of the quilt. And we have bias squares used in sailboat. Look at those bright colored sails, the white sails, which show against the blue background of the bias square. Now let's learn how to make these amazing bias squares. How do we make these wonderful bias squares? Well, we begin by layering 2 pieces of fabric, and in this case I have a piece of muslin and a piece of print, and I layer them with the right sides together so when I pick them up they're going to be ready to sew. We're going to begin by making our first cut, a bias cut, and I'll show you how to do that. Most rulers will have a 45-degree angle marking on it, which you can position along one edge and follow that. Or if your ruler does not, we're going to take the bias square, align its bias marking along one edge, position your ruler right next to that, and we'll be ready to make the first cut. We're going to click the guard off and make our first cut. There we are. Now we can move this away and we're ready to cut our first strip. Now watch as I turn my fabric around. Remember, we want the fabric and the board to be in a comfortable position for you to make these cuts. Place our ruler on the edge of the fabric and we need to cut the first strip. But what width? Well, our rule is that the width of the strip is the same as the cut size of the bias square. So if the quilt that I'm making is going to have 2.5-inch cut bias squares, which would turn into 2-inch finished bias squares, then I cut my strip the same width, or the same size as the cut bias square, 2.5 inches. I'll click my guard off and cut down the length of the fabric, and there we have our 2.5-inch strips. These strips are ready for me to take to the sewing machine and sew together. When we sew these bias strips together, we follow the very same rules as we did with our long strips. We're going to place right sides together, align raw edges, and sew with an accurate 1/4-inch seam allowance. It's time to press our bias strips. The rules are the same when we press these bias strips. We're going to press the seam allowance toward the darker fabric, which in this case is the pink, and I'll spread my fabric as I go down the length of it and press, not iron. I will press first from the wrong side of the fabric. When that's done, I'll turn it over and press from the right side. All right, let's turn it over. And we want to press from the right side to make sure that there are no pleats, that the seam allowance is nice and flat. Now we're ready to go cut those bias squares. Now that we've stitched our strips together and pressed them, we're actually ready to begin cutting our bias squares. I place my fabric down on my board, and I take my bias square and I'm going to align it on one end of the strip. Now we mentioned we're cutting 2.5-inch bias squares, and you remember from earlier that our first cut removes the fabric from the strip. So I'm positioning the bias square on top of the strip so that our diagonal line is aligned with the seam line, and the 2.5-inch will be on the strip. We're not making an exact cut, we're just separating the fabric. And I go up, and you may need to tilt your board to get the most comfortable position for you. Up and over, and I pull that apart. Now I'm going to move the bias square down the length of the strip, cutting these little chevron-shaped segments every 2.5 inches. I'm going to cut up and over, and we're going to move down, and we're going to cut another one. And what you want to be sure of is that you're allowing yourself enough room for a 2.5-inch square when we go back and make the second cut. Now we need to cut the second size to make them accurate. So I'm going to take my board, turn it around again, and work my way down against these strips again, making my second cut. This time when I align the bias square, not only do I align the diagonal line down the middle, but the 2.5-inch mark goes right along the edge, because this is where we make our accurate cut. So we'll go up and over, move our bias square down, and again go up and over, and there you have it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 perfectly accurate bias squares. You can see the advantage of the technique. There are 5 wonderful, perfectly accurate bias squares. But there's also a disadvantage. We have some waist triangles here, and this bothered me. So I thought about it and came up with a way to resize them and to use them. And I'll share this with you later on. Right now I'd like you to turn off the video and practice cutting some bias squares. As I mentioned earlier, those waist triangles bothered me. So I worked with Marcia McCloskey to come up with a technique that would result in less waist triangles. So we decided, instead of stitching together just 2 strips of fabric, why not do 4 or 5 or even 6, so we would have less waist triangles result. I'd like to show you how to cut bias squares from those multiple strips. Let's take a little look at this Ocean Waves quilt here. We see it's from muslin and blue fabrics. Well, if we wanted to cut some bias squares from that and wanted to piece multiple strips, we would stitch together muslin, navy, muslin, navy, muslin, navy. Remembering that the fabric along the outside will be the one that gives us waist triangles. How wide should those strips be? Well, our rule earlier was to cut the strips just as wide as the finished bias square. So I'm still cutting 2.5 inch bias squares, so I'm still going to cut 2.5 inch strips. When you piece these multiple strips together, don't be concerned if they're varying lengths. Look at those tails I have down there. It's going to happen that way because your bias strips are going to come from various pieces of fabric. Don't be concerned about that. You need to start at one end, the lowest point towards you, and begin cutting your squares across the fabric. Now remember, we can turn our board to the most comfortable position for us. We're going to place our bias square on the seam, again with the diagonal line right on the seam, and we're going to start making the first cut across the fabric. Now remember, this just separates it from the fabric, and I need to make sure the 2.5 inches on there, and I'll cut up and over, and I'll pull that aside because I'll go back and make all those second cuts later. I'll move up to the very next seam. We just want to make sure that we're separating it with a large enough piece to cut our 2.5 inch bias square from that later. And we'll move up one more seam and up, over, and to the last seam, up and over. And now we'll need to turn all of those around, and I usually try to stack them so that the cut sides together. I'll turn them around, and one at a time we'll go through with the bias square and resize them, making sure that the diagonal line of the bias square is down the middle, and we'll go up and over, up, and across. And there you see, I went across the entire row, cutting perfectly accurate bias squares. I didn't even have a waist triangle. Actually, if I made one more cut, another waist triangle would emerge here. And I'm going to take that off because the very next thing I want to share with you is how to resize those waist triangles. Remember the waist triangles I had earlier? Let's bring those back on the board here and I'll show you how to resize them. We're now ready to resize the waist triangles. There are 3 simple rules that you can follow, directions to help you cut these all to the needed size. And if you think about the shape of a triangle and what it has, it'll help you remember these rules or guidelines. The first thing is we need a right angle in the corner. So we position the bias square on top of the waist triangle, and we're going to slice anything that is beyond that right angle in the corner. Then we're going to turn the bias square. We're going to put the ruler on top. And remember, we were cutting 2.5 inch bias squares. So we need to align this with the 2.5 inch marking on each edge. So we'll slice anything over, and sometimes there isn't anything that's over. Now the third step is to get your angle cut, and we need to pivot the bias square around and put the very first marking, the 1/4 inch marking, it almost looks like a little arrow there. Put that in the corner of your waist triangle, align the diagonal along the edge, and that will give you your third cut. Let me practice that a couple times for you to resize the waist triangles. Remember, it was a right angle in the corner, so we'll do that. Then we need to size it. And we're working with a 2.5 inch size, so we'll put our bias square on top, and we're going to trim at 2.5 inches, 2.5 inches. Anything beyond that will be trimmed away. Then we're going to pivot the bias square so that that little 1/4 inch mark is right there in the corner. The bias line is along one edge, and we make our final cut getting our diagonal line. Now's a good time for you to stop the video and practice cutting bias squares from those multiple strips that you've stitched together. While you're at it, it's also a good time to practice cutting and resizing those waist triangles. Remember, there are 3 little rules that will help you cut and shape those waist triangles. We need to put a right angle in each corner. Then we need to turn our bias square and align the measurement so we can cut it the correct size. Then we pivot our bias square, put that 1/4 inch marking or that little arrow in the corner of the triangle and the bias line along one edge, and you're ready to make that final cut. Now, it's a good time for you to have some fun cutting bias squares. Now that you've mastered the technique of cutting bias squares, you need to know what size and what color they'll be in a specific quilt design. And to do that, we need to analyze some quilts to know what kind of strips to cut. Let's look at this Delectable Mountains quilt. It's a 2-color quilt, just red and muslin. So the only color strips we would need to cut for the bias squares would be our red print and our muslin. And these are alternated across muslin, red, muslin, red, muslin. Notice I have the muslin on the outside. Remember earlier I told you whatever strips are placed on the outside will result in your waist triangles. Well, we don't need any waist triangles in this Delectable Mountains quilt. So this muslin will truly be waist, and it'll be up to us whether we want to resize it or not. For this Lady of Lake quilt, the bias squares are made of varying shades of blue. And if we look at the bias squares, we'll see that each bias square has a dark triangle and a lighter one, a dark and a lighter, a dark and a lighter. Well, what color strips would we use to piece these bias squares, and how would we arrange them? Let's look at this. This would be the segments we would stitch together to cut bias squares from multiple strips. And you can see I've alternated a dark strip with a lighter, a dark strip with a lighter, a dark strip with a lighter. For this Scrappy Ocean Waves quilt, we've got a real assortment of fabrics here, and they're not always arranged in a light-dark pattern. If we look here, we see we have a lot of darks, and then every once in a while there'll be a lighter tone come in, but it isn't a regular pattern at all. And so when we stitch those strips together, they're also stitched together in a random order. Here we have mainly dark shades alternated with each other. There are no lights used in this particular cutting segment. And remember that the pieces along the outside edges will be the pieces that result in waist triangles. They'll be part of your bias squares, but that will also be the color of your waist triangles. Let's take a look at this Ocean Waves quilt behind me and figure out the strips that were cut to piece it. We see that for our bias squares we've alternated light background fabrics that have a pink in them with green fabrics. And you notice that on the outside edges I have the light background fabric. Why is that? Because we need the light background fabrics for the waist triangles. When we look at this smokehouse block, we can see that it has 5 bias squares. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 2 waist triangles. And you'll notice the waist triangles are from the light background fabric. So this would be the correct piecing sequence, giving us our light fabrics on the outside of the strip for the waist triangles. I've mentioned how easy it is to cut small size bias squares for feathered star quilts or miniature quilts. And let's take a look at a feathered star quilt that has some of these bias squares in them. This is Twinkling Stars. And if we examine the bias squares on the inside edges, we'll see that they were cut 1 1/4 inches, and they finish 3/4 of an inch. That's a real easy size to cut. In fact, I'd like to show you how easy it is. I have 2 strips of fabric, muslin in a color, that were used to make the feathers on this feathered star quilt. The one thing different is the way we press the seam allowance. Instead of pressing the seam allowance toward the darker fabric, we press it open flat, right down the middle. This helps to distribute the bulk of the fabric and makes your seams less lumpy and easier to quilt over. Now we're ready to cut. Let's turn it over, take our bias square, and it's the same technique as before. We align the diagonal line down the middle, and we want to make sure that at least 1 1/4 inches is on here. Turn your board to make it comfortable for you, and we're going to cut the first two sides of the bias square just to separate our fabric. We're going to move it down, and again, cut the first two sides. As before, we need to turn our board, come from the other direction, and make the final cut. These 1¼ inch bias squares will be the perfect size for the feathers on this feathered star quilt. Bias squares are wonderful for borders also. When we look at this Delectable Mountains quilt, we see a single row of bias squares that are sewn together to make a sawtooth border. And if you look closely, you'll see at the top of this border, right in the middle, we've changed the direction of the bias square. This helps us split the border. Part of the bias squares go in one direction and part in the other, and this enables all four corners to look the same. We can also make a double sawtooth border from these bias squares. Here we see bias squares in a row across the top, then we have a single spacer strip and another row of bias squares. You'll see that we also break the bias squares in the middle and change the direction. So this double sawtooth border also has all four corners the same. It's even possible to do a triple sawtooth border. Here, this center section of an applique tulip quilt is surrounded by a triple row of bias squares for a triple sawtooth borders. Again, we break the direction in the middle and all four corners come out looking the same. There are some other interesting things that we can do with bias squares for borders. If we look at this Amish wedding ring quilt, look how the bias square unit has been incorporated into the border. It's right in the center of a piece triangle section. And when we look at the sailboat quilt, look also at the border there. This time the bias square is used between the large triangles and not as part of them, and helps make an effective border. Now that you've learned how to make bias squares, I hope that you're encouraged to use them in your quilts, and you'll discover the joy of making more quilts.
Look for these books from That Patchwork Place, which feature quilts made from Back to Square One, Little by Little, A Banner Year, Ocean Waves. If you enjoy rotary cutting, you'll love our template-free series written by Trudy Hughes. Template-free quilt making, more template-free quilt making, even more. Ask for these books and the Bias Square at your favorite stores. To enjoy the convenience of shopping by mail, or just to see all the great quilt books published by That Patchwork Place, send $2 refundable on your first order for a color catalog. Send to That Patchwork Place Incorporated, Post Office Box 118, Bothell, Washington 98041-0118.